Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report number 118-511, offered by Mr. Norman of South Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1227, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I applaud Congressman Van Drew and his leadership on this issue and proud to support his legislation to detain illegal immigrants who assault law enforcement. My amendment is really straightforward, and I believe in line with the goals of the underlying bill. My amendment simply ensures that campus police officers and school resource officers are considered law enforcement officers for the purpose of the bill's provisions. In light of the increase in violent protests on college campuses, it is especially important that we show these brave campus police officers that we have their back. Under President Biden's watch, nearly 4.7 million illegals have been released, and more than 1.8 million known illegal aliens, gotaways, have escaped into the United States. In South Carolina alone, we have over 175,000 illegal aliens in my home state. These include dangerous individuals who violate our laws and then assault the law enforcement officers who put their lives on the line to protect our communities. It is imperative that we fight back against the Biden administration's radical open borders policy by mandating immigration detention for illegal aliens who assault law enforcement officers. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to explicitly ensure that our hardworking campus police officers and resource officers are afforded the same protections as other law enforcement officers under this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Does the gentleman reserve?
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would expand the scope of this already bad bill to include campus police and school resource officers under the term law enforcement officers. Unfortunately, this amendment makes a bad bill even worse while highlighting one of the many flaws in the bill. First, the fact that Mr. Norman felt the need to file this amendment to begin with just highlights the lack of clarity around this bill. As we've discussed, this bill will subject any inadmissible immigrant to mandatory immigration detention for merely being arrested or charged with assault on a law enforcement officer or first responder. But the bill lacks any definition for what is considered a first responder. Mr. Norman was clearly concerned with this as well and felt the need to make sure that campus police and school resources officers were included. Unfortunately, Mr. Norman's amendment does not bring any additional clarity to the definition of first responder, and it even adds another undefined term, school resource officer. Now, Mr. Norman could easily have remedied this by choosing the definition that exists in Title 34 of the U.S. Code, but for some reason he did not. States all over the country use different definitions for school resource officers. They have different duties and functions depending on the state. So this amendment raises far more questions than it begins to answer. On top of the poor drafting, this amendment expands an already bad bill and makes the bill worse. As I discussed during general debate, it is quite common during protests for law enforcement to arrest an entire group of people after one person in the crowd gets unruly. After the largely peaceful protests that we've seen on college campuses over the last month, protests made up largely of young people and teenagers, it would be a mistake to extend this definition to include campus police. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Yeah, it's unbelievable that those listening to this debate going on in the chambers, I think we've all seen the college campuses, the protests that you're talking about. Many include breaking windows, knocking down doors. It's not protest. This is a destruction of property. This has no place on the college campuses. And to have the presidents and the tenured professors to be quiet on this, and to have students scared to go to class, and to cancel exams. That's not what they pay money for. That's not what the taxpayers deserve. No, this is very simple. This is, if you're a resource officer, your job is to protect the students and the facilities. And if you're in law enforcement on the campuses, hired by the individual school, you're there to protect the campus and protect the students. And, you know, I'm sick and tired of these liberals who keep saying peaceful protests. It's like the 50 cities that were burned a couple of years ago. That's not a peaceful protest. That's destruction of the property that has consequences. All we're saying is give these officers the protection that law enforcement has. And it shouldn't even have to be said for me to have to bring this amendment. It is a shame that we've reached this point in this country that we're having to define what a resource officer is. And I would ask all those who maybe question this, you go out and volunteer to be a resource officer or sign up to be a resource officer. You go out and sign up to protect the campus. And let's see how the tables will turn. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, none of us are condoning violence on campuses. All I said is that the vast majority of protesters on campuses have been peaceful. And what happens when one person does something and the entire group is arrested is relevant for this amendment. I don't think anybody believes that that should be the case. And I'm not really sure why the gentleman felt the need to clarify exactly what the definition was in this underlying legislation, except that it wasn't clear, which is the point that I've been making all along. But the problem is that the amendment actually makes other terms unclear as well. So as I said, I oppose this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman